And then I just want to say thank you to Massillon Public Library for hosting this program and co-presenting with us, and for the great tech department that they have for getting this stuff set up for us. And so tonight we're hosting author Kathy Schulz, an Ohio native who grew up on her family farm in Columbiana County, predating the Civil War, and surrounded by Underground Railroad folklore. Her birthplace of Salem was an important Quaker abolitionist town, and she later resided in Springfield Township, which is also an important freedom seeker route. Schulz is a retired librarian. She worked as reference librarian and library director of Wittenberg University. She also holds a Bachelor of Science in Education from Ohio State University, a Museum and Library Information Science degree from Kent State University, and a Master of Humanities from Wright State University. Her latest book, The Underground Railroad in Ohio, was just published January 9th of this year with the History Press. She also authored Telling the Story, the Rupert, Van Sciver, Moore, and Brown Families, which was released in 2020, so you can check that out as well. The Underground Railroad in Ohio details a dark time in United States history when thousands of freedom seekers traveled the Underground Railroad through Ohio. The Buckeye State hosted about half of all fugitive slave traffic in the antebellum era. A mix of northern and southern settlers in the state added drama to a struggle that led to major benefits for the state and the country. Unfortunately, this epic past was obscured by silence and secrecy, and then distorted with misinformation and folklore until now. Schulz accurately details the development and workings of Ohio's Underground Railroad with true stories of Addison White, John Parker, and other abolitionists around Ohio. Schulz and her husband currently live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she stays busy with friends, hobbies, and grandchildren. And please join me in welcoming Kathy Schulz.
Very sweet and very professional, thank you. And I am just delighted to be here. You certainly make me feel welcome with all this interest. I told this lady right here I would speak loudly. And
that's good, right there.
Okay, I need to, I believe I'll be okay, but if you ever can't hear me, put up your hand or something like that. I want to thank Spring Hill Historic Home for hosting this, as well as the Massillon Public Library. I am really pleased to be here. And before I go into what I normally say, I want to tell you, I think I'm learning more about the Underground Railroad as I go around on this book tour after I've written the book. I learn things every town I go to. In Massillon, I learned an interesting thing. Your Spring Hill home, that was the home of Thomas Roach? Thomas Roach? I was curious about that, and so I started looking things up. I found that he and a fellow in my little tiny town in Columbiana County had a whole series of letters back and forth about raising sheep. And the reason I got kind of interested in that, I think it was David Humphreys who provided these sheep. He got them in Spain or Portugal. Spain. Well, if I read that, that would have been Greek to me, but here's the funny thing. Here are the weird connections in life. After college, my son was an historical character, an interpreter at Williamsburg and at Mount Vernon. Guess who he played at Mount Vernon? David Humphreys. So when I read the Humphreys sheep thing, I thought, oh, I know who that is. Okay. So that's my weird connection to Massillon. Okay, and Kayla wanted me to mention, you folks seem so interested. In case you have friends that couldn't get here, I have they're keeping me busy. I have other events coming up. Tomorrow night I'm at the Haynes House, I'm actually at the Rodman Public Library in Alliance at 6:30 tomorrow night. Wednesday afternoon I'm at the Columbiana Public Library, that's sort of my old home place. Saturday, I'm at the Cozad Bates House in Cleveland. They're a big Underground Railroad, it's sort of an Underground Railroad home on University Circle. And I'll be in Salem, the Salem Historical Society on Valentine's Day. So maybe those are some places sort of near if anyone else is interested. Okay, let's get going here. What are we going to do? I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to write the book. I'm going to I'll tell you about the book. and show you a few slides. I will do a reading from the book, and then we'll probably have time for some Q&A. So, Kayla gave a good description of who I am. I'm a perennial student. My husband would tell you I like going to school. So I got a bunch of degrees. But anyway, who am I and why did I write this book? As I said, I was born in Columbiana County. And you probably know Salem and some of the other towns there had a high Underground Railroad importance. And I cannot remember not knowing about the Underground Railroad. I suppose I learned about it from my parents, but I feel like I always knew about it. And I like to say that before I knew what the word metaphor meant, I understood that the Underground Railroad was just a clever name that grown-ups had given this effort, and it had nothing to do with trains down in tunnels. It was a clever name for black people moving north toward freedom in Canada who had stayed in the homes and the farms and the towns very close to where I lived. And I was just always interested in it. Now, fast forward 30 years after that, and I'm in my mid-30s, and I was a librarian at Wittenberg. And I was poking around in the library archives. This is in the mid-'80s, or late 80s, but it's pre-internet, pre a lot of stuff, pre-cell phones, pre-everything. I came across a short summary of a local Underground Railroad incident that I was just fascinated by. The person, it was describing an incident that involved Addison White. Addison White was a freedom seeker who had gotten himself out of Kentucky, and his job was to make salt, where they have salt licks in Kentucky, and you dig these little wells and you pull out the water and you boil it and you end up with salt. But he was mistreated, and he had to get out of there to save himself. So he got himself across the Ohio River, got to the little town of Mechanicsburg, Ohio, which is sort of near Columbus. It's northwest of Columbus. Not a big town, kind of a little town. But when he got to Mechanicsburg, the folks there said, go to the house of Utney Hyde. He always helps freedom seekers. So Addison White went there. And Utney, the white man, said, okay, sure, yeah, stay, rest up. But in just a couple of days, we're going to move on, get you moving on north, because it's not safe to stay in one place too long. So that was the plan, but here was what happened. Utney worked with big logs, making railroad ties and split rail fences and things. And one of these big logs rolled against his leg and crushed him. So while Addison is living with him for this supposedly brief period, Utney's leg just gets mauled. And Addison looks at him and he says, well, Mr. Hyde, who's going to do your work? Who's going to pick your corn? Who's going to do this blacksmith work? Who's going to do your rail fences and everything? He said, I know how to do stuff. I can do that. He said, I'm not going to Canada. I will stay here and help you. Well, Utney at first wasn't real sure that was a great idea, but he needed help, so he agreed. And Addison lived with him for 9 months over the winter. And we're coming back to that story. There's more stuff that happens, but I just want to tell you that that's the beginning of the Addison White story. And when I read it, and what's to come, I thought, wow, this is the best story. Why didn't I already know this story? I was actually kind of sad, because I thought, Americans should know this. This should be something school kids learn when they grow up. And everyone's nodding. Addison White was a hero, and I see him as a kind of a cool American, like Davy Crockett or Johnny Appleseed, or the kind of American kids should learn about. And I thought, could I do anything to publicize his story? But I was 35 with other things to do. That was sort of impossible. So I just moved on, but I never forgot the Addison White story. Okay, then let's fast forward another 30 years. And now I'm in my 60s, and like of a lot of Americans, I take a DNA test. The results weren't very noteworthy. I'm standard European stuff here, Northern European stuff. But I got interested in my family tree, and I thought, well, who are these British Isle people, and who are these German people? And that's the book I wrote, she mentioned. I really just wrote that for my cousins. I don't know that any of you are going to want to buy it. It's on Amazon, don't worry about it. But I got very interested in family history, and I mapped out my family tree. And what I saw in that family tree was that I hadn't realized all this, that I had family lines in Ohio from the early 1800s, some of them, and I looked at what they were. They were Quakers, they were Presbyterians, and I looked at where they lived, and I thought, oh, do I have ancestors that were in the Underground Railroad? I had never been told that, but it sure looked like it might be possible. So then, hey, I love research. That's what librarians do. We just sort of love it. So then I wanted to know more about the Underground Railroad, because I decided, well, how can I understand what these folks might have been up to if I don't really understand the Underground Railroad? Because this is what I decided, that I didn't know much more at age 66 about the Underground Railroad than I had known at 6. I had learned a lot of folklore, stuff about tunnels and codes, secret codes sewn into quilts, drinking gourd song, a whole lot of stuff. But I wasn't sure, I should trust that folklore, and we shouldn't. I wanted to know what really happened. So I started doing a lot of research, and I read, there are historians that have done good work on the Underground Railroad. I read them. I read memoirs and autobiographies. I didn't realize how many people who had been in the Underground Railroad, either as freedom seekers or as Underground Railroad operatives, station owners, conductors, things like that. I didn't realize how many of those people had left memoirs. There are a lot of them. Harriet Tubman was one who did, and there are plenty of other ones. Some of these people dictated their memoirs, some of them wrote it. But anyway, I read all those memoirs, of just about everyone I could find, I think. I read the papers of Professor Wilbur Siebert at Ohio State. Do some of you people here, you're into Underground Railroad, and do you know the papers of Wilbur Siebert? Yeah. Okay, he was an Ohio State professor that began researching the Underground Railroad right around 1890, when there were still people alive that you could communicate with. And he kept right on at it until he died in 1960. He did a life's work of this. And he compiled lots and lots of documents and letters and transcripted interviews and everything. And all of that material is at the Ohio Historical Connection in Columbus. And I had kind of known about Siebert's work, but what I learned just a few years ago was that it had all been scanned and digitized and is searchable and was available to me for free, even in my home in New Mexico, where I retired to. I'm a native Ohioan. New Mexico is a retirement thing. But anyway, I could access this Siebert material, and I thought, oh, okay, I can do this. I can do this. Yeah, I think I meant to show you. Well, it's okay. And about that, I returned to the Addison White story and read everything I could find about Addison White, and that story only kept getting better. But about this same time, there were some important novels coming out. Someone mentioned to me here tonight that Colson Whitehead wrote his novel, The Underground Railroad. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a novel on the Underground Railroad. Those books use magical realism. The Whitehead novel is the one where he wrote it as if there really had been real trains down in these real tunnels. And yeah, you're laughing, I know. And how many people read it? Okay. Okay, he won a boatload of awards for that, and everyone said it was genius. Okay. But it might have been clever for him to do it that way, but I will just go ahead and tell you that his book pissed me off. Bear with me.
Pissed me off too.
It pissed me off. It pissed me off. But it's kind of funny. What actually pissed me off about it was not the clever little trains in the tunnels. It was where he set his story. He had those trains and tunnels down in Georgia in South Carolina.
Oh.
No. You're one of the better crowds I've talked to. Right, okay, the Underground Railroad was in the northern states, it's in the free states, and primarily Ohio. And I should already have clicked to this slide. There, okay, there's our Underground Railroad. That shows the Underground Railroad routes all over the country, so really, but where is it focused? It's focused on Ohio, for heaven's sakes. Okay, well, and Colson Whitehead has his stuff going on down here, and other than a few boats that came up along the coast, there wasn't much that happened down there. So anyway, that annoyed me. And I will tell you that I hang around with some pretty well-educated, bright people. And when we read the books I just mentioned in book group, these women made some of the lamest comments about the Underground Railroad. They're from all over the country, but they didn't really know much about it. And I could tell that Americans sort of don't have a clue. I'm getting a lot of nods on this. Okay, so then I thought, well, why doesn't someone write an entertaining, accessible book that explains the Underground Railroad actually and gives Ohio some credit, for God's sake? So I'm going to show you my next slide. I had come across that quote. That's from our Ohio writer, Toni Morrison, that we lost just a couple years ago. This is her quote. "If there's a book that you want to read but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it." I let that one float around in my brain for a couple days. I really thought about that, and I thought, okay, you're right, Toni, you're on. I'm doing it. I'm going to do this. So that is what led me to write the book. Now, that gets us to the book itself. And in some ways, the book represents me teaching myself what I wanted to know about the Underground Railroad. And I think maybe Kayla already mentioned that the amount of traffic, we left that slide, but the amount of traffic coming through Ohio probably equals that of all the other states put together. But why? I mean, what were the reasons for that, and how did the whole thing develop? I also wanted to show that the real stories of the Underground Railroad were every bit as good as the fiction those guys made up. The truth really is better than fiction a lot of times. So that was my goal in writing the book, to show these real stories were very interesting. So, but one thing I do, just some background information at first. I go back and look at Ohio history and see how it was set up for the Underground Railroad. How did Ohio get settled? Now, maybe maybe, I don't know. But the first chunk of Ohio that was purchased by Anglo-European people was the Ohio Company down here, and they were from New England. So you've got New Englanders. In the early days of white settlement, there's a New England influence down here, as there was in the Connecticut Western Reserve, obviously. Do you know that when Connecticut was formed back in colonial times, the Connecticut people said, Connecticut is a long, skinny state. Our borders just keep going west. They just continue, like right through New York and Pennsylvania. Well, New York and Pennsylvania said, no, they don't. But when Ohio lands became available, the government said, oh, okay, Connecticut, you can control that part. So there you go. Then the first part of Ohio that was surveyed and sold as saleable lots to individuals was what was called the Seven Ranges, and that is sort of these counties that are stacked up in eastern Ohio along the river. And for a lot of reasons, Quakers settled there. A lot of Quakers, including the county that I grew up in. Okay, then you may also have heard about military land grants for the men who had fought in the American Revolution and then later on the War of 1812. There were military land grants all over the place. So let's talk a little bit about those veterans of the American Revolution. When we were, a lot of you are about my age, and when we were kids, we probably had a school book, that had a picture of George Washington on a horse and a lot of white soldiers standing around him. Who can remember a picture like that? Yeah, we all remember that picture. Guess what? It's not correct. It's not a fair picture. Because many African Americans fought in the American Revolution, particularly in the later years of the American Revolution. So showing all white soldiers is just not accurate. So the thing, when units were integrated, no one made a fuss about it. Units are integrated. So does this mean that all the military veterans of the American Revolution were completely non-racist and had all egalitarian views? Well, maybe not, but we like to think that some familiarity had developed and some level of acceptance, and those attitudes were carried into Ohio. And then lastly in Ohio was the Virginia Military District over there. I worked in Springfield, Ohio, the town of Springfield over there. But so I was sort of near over there. Like, that's where Wittenberg is. Anyway, Virginia was such a big, powerful state. When the Revolutionary War was fought, it included Kentucky. So, it included West Virginia, and it also included Kentucky. So it was this big landmass that went all the way to the Mississippi River. And Virginia said, hey, Ohio, we know you have all those millions of acres of land to give away, but we're kind of worried that you're going to run out before all our deserving veterans get their shares. So they made a certain place for Virginia there. Now, let's talk Virginians. If I say Virginia, that probably sounds like they were pro-slavery. Sounds like it, right? Some were, of course, some were. But the group that came to Ohio was more of a self-selecting group because they were choosing to leave the slave economy. They didn't have to come. No one forced them to come. They were people, a lot of them were comfortable going from that slave economy to a free economy. And some of them had been slave owners when they were in Virginia. If they were contemplating a move north to this land grant, they had to figure out, what do I do with my enslaved people? A lot of them chose to bring those folks along, that freedom. As soon as they cross the Ohio River, all those people are free. So there were people that came that way. Okay. And then the other thing, further out the anti-slavery continuum, there were people of the South who weren't just comfortable leaving slavery or maybe beginning to question it. There were some Southerners who were adamantly opposed to slavery. They had lived among it, they had seen it, they knew what it was, and they hated it. And there are a bunch of, there are people coming from the Upper South. Some of these Quakers came out of the Upper South. Some of these Virginians were actually anti-slavery. The example, where's Mr. Rankin here? I talked to Rankin.
Over here.
Okay, all right. Your possible ancestor or your relative, Reverend John Rankin, is the example we often use for that. He was a kind of a rabid anti-slavery Presbyterian minister, and he had grown up in Tennessee. So there are people coming up out of the South that were very good, very effective spokespeople against slavery because they had an accurate idea what it was. The argument, the abolitionist talk up in Boston could be kind of abstract or hypothetical because those folks didn't know it as well. These people coming out of the South, they knew it. Now, before we move on, these lines aren't exact because in America, we buy land, we sell land, we speculate, we move around, okay? So it's not like all the Virginians were here and all the Connecticut people were there. It gets a little mixed up. But there are influences in those areas. Okay, and Ohio, when the Constitution was written in 1803, they wrote in the anti-slavery clause. Do you know that passed by one vote? Only one. But it passed. It passed. But if this makeup of Ohio had been different, the outcome could have been different. But anyway, Ohio was from its very beginning anti-slavery. Okay, what else? Oh, all right, I was sort of talking about white people coming out of the South. We haven't talked a lot about black people coming out of the South, and we should, because a lot of free blacks were coming as well. Okay. Okay, some of the blacks got military grants just like the white fellows did. There are examples of black soldiers getting a military land grant in Ohio. But there were other ways that free blacks came into Ohio. There were a lot of black people, some workers were able to purchase their freedom. Men that worked in foundries and factories. They didn't have assembly lines back then. No one had thought that up. So everyone had a certain amount they were supposed to do every day. You had a quota. If you met that quota and you did more, you were paid in cash. You were given a bonus, and that usually happened fairly. So over time, some of those workers could save that money up and buy themselves. There were people being freed by benevolent owners or in an owner's will. And of course, some people simply escaped. But here's the thing. If you were a recently freed black person in a southern state, you actually had a bit of a problem. The laws there were written assuming an enslaved status for people of color, for black people. The laws just assume you're a slave. And actually, you could stay only a few months when you could legally be sold and put back into slavery again. And that could also happen illegally any old time at all, because there were unscrupulous slave traders and people like that who would grab a person and sell them for $1, or more than $1, no doubt. But anyway, to be a free black in the South, there are some people who figured out how to continue living there safely. But many of those folks saw the problems they would have there and decided, we better go somewhere else. Where should we go? Ohio. It's free, let's go to Ohio. Okay, now the reason this slide is up, when lots of free blacks were coming into Ohio, and not all of them, but many of them lived in special settlements. I talked down in Ripley, and this is near there. This is down near the Ohio River, kind of near Cincinnati. These are called the Gist settlement. They pronounce it Gist down there. It's named for Samuel Gist, who was an incredibly wealthy Englishman who owned a huge tract of land in Florida, and he owned between 300 and 5,000 enslaved people. In his will, he freed all of them. Sold the land, freed everybody, and he made arrangements for them to be transported to Ohio, and he left money for building of small homes, farm implements, seed, the things he thought they would need to get started in Ohio. So these were the Gist settlements, and there are other settlements around. Are there any in York County that you know of? Okay, some people I've been places and they say, oh yes, yeah, we had one, blah, blah. So some of the African Americans were living in special settlements, others were living any place, but that's an interesting thing to know. But the reason this is important, the beginning of the Underground Railroad, and let's say it's been around as long as Ohio's been a state. We could even use 1800 if we want. Slaves have always wanted to get away. The beginning of the Underground Railroad was people of color helping other people of color. Very few white folks were interested in this problem in 1810. Okay, back then it was people of color helping people of color. And why am I making a special point to say people of color? Because that's kind of fun. Who was in Northwest Ohio? Indians, they're people of color. And they, up until 1830, They had not yet been pushed out of Northwest Ohio, and they were the prominent population group in the Northwest. They weren't real crazy about white folks either, okay? And they were happy to help the freedom seekers coming through, probably people coming up and they were going into Michigan and then across into Canada. So Indians were indeed part of the Underground Railroad. Okay, now here, let's go to school and talk about cotton. This is stuff we probably learned in 5th grade or so. Cotton gin, developed in the 1790s. By the time Ohio became a state, do I have a, oh, I didn't mean to do that. I was wanting to see if I had a pointer.
You do?
How do I get back to where I was? Oh, I just, okay, where's my pointer? Well, I don't have
haven't used it in a
Okay,
while.
you know what? Oh, there it is, the middle button. I hit the wrong button. Okay, cotton gin. Cotton moved west. The soil was, sometimes these don't work, okay, heck with it. Sometimes, well, the soil over here was wearing out, so the cotton had moved west over closer to the Mississippi. Cotton growers made a lot of money. Cotton was incredibly lucrative, but they needed workers. They didn't have enough workers down there. They wanted more and more people down in the cotton. What had happened in 1807, both England and the United States had passed laws against the international slave trade. So you weren't going to be bringing your workers in from Africa anymore, okay? So you had to figure out how to get them out of your population. So that put stress on the African American population that was already here. So where are you going to go to get these folks? How did people travel? Rivers, okay? You go up the Mississippi and up its tributary, and what state is sitting right here with a long river border and it's got enslaved people in it? Kentucky. Kentucky, and also you had the Natchez Trace, which went right up into the heart of Kentucky. Kentucky became kind of the go-to place to get more workers down in the cotton and the sugar cane in Louisiana. And I guess I should say that there was such a demand for enslaved workers down here that the price of an enslaved person down in Mississippi, Alabama, was 40% more than it was up in Kentucky or Upper Virginia. 40% more. So what's going to happen? You can kind of see where that's going. So let's talk about what life was like for these folks up in Kentucky. Well, we're not going to say slavery was tolerable and they had an easy time of it, but we probably can say they had a less awful time of it than these folks down in the cane and the cotton. So what's that mean? The farms are smaller, the work's a little more doable, there's food, okay? So that means those people in the Upper South, particularly Kentucky, they were able to couple and have babies and have a good fertility rate. But oh, what is the problem? The babies aren't needed up there. They are needed down here. So the people of Kentucky got it. They understood. They had zero family security. Your wife, your husband, your kid, anyone could be sold down the river at any time. And it became acceptable and commonplace for families to be broken up. So these Kentucky people got it. And it got so bad that slaves or enslaved people were regarded as a product of the state of Kentucky. Kentucky exports slaves, along with horses, bourbon, tobacco, all that Kentucky stuff. Slaves were a part of that picture. So, and that's pretty nasty, but that's really how people thought back in 1820 or thereabouts. Okay, so we know what those Kentucky folks are going to want to do, but before we before we talk about that more, I want to throw another factor at you. The War of 1812. What do you think people learned about during the War of 1812? A place they'd never much gone, Canada. A lot of that war was fought up near the US-Canadian border. And so uneducated people before the War of 1812 may not have heard of Canada. They didn't know anything about it. But during the War of 1812, people went up there. Enslaved people went up there because it was not uncommon for a white soldier of the South might take an enslaved servant with him when he went off to war. So these people are going up to Canada, and they are understanding, free blacks fought up there, but then when the war's over and everyone comes home, they think, oh, look, there was a country up there had no slavery at all. We would be accepted up there, and so it was really the War of 1812 that after that people got the idea of going to Canada. Okay. Now this next slide. All right. We're back to that Underground Railroad map slide. That if the enslaved population knows, hey, Canada's a good place to go, who in that enslaved population could really actually get there? Who knew there was a network of people to help them? It wasn't the people down in the cane and the cotton. They probably, a lot of them never heard of the Underground Railroad. It didn't really happen down in the Deep South other than these few boats out of harbors here. It was pretty much the people and that blue band that I drew there. The Underground Railroad did not exist in Virginia or Kentucky. It was really up here, and you had to get yourself to it. How are you going to do that? You're going to walk, okay? Can you walk for a month from down in North Carolina, or walk for 2 months? Pretty hard. There are exceptional people that manage to do things like that, but they were rare. Most of the people who came just out of that northern part of the upper South. So clearly, this is explaining why you've got these Kentucky people and they are coming into Ohio. For heaven's sakes, they want out of Kentucky. Some of them weren't necessarily mistreated. Some were, some weren't. But they understood this lack of family security thing and they wanted out. There was something else. Oh, I know what. When I give these talks, people say, well, how many people are you talking? What are your numbers, okay? And the scholars have a hard time with that because the numbers of the Underground Railroad are a little tough. But of the whole period, let's say from 1800 to 1865, how many people used the Underground Railroad to go north? Maybe somewhere around 100,000 is a guess. That's what the scholars say. Well, I don't know if that sounds like a big number or not, but it's not though, because when you consider that the amount of the enslaved population at the start of the Civil War was 4 million in that 1 year, 100,000 over all that time, maybe about 1% of the enslaved people ever were able to use the Underground Railroad. Now that the percent would have been higher in that blue band. It would have, had a higher percent here, but if you put all these other states in, there wasn't very many that could use the Underground Railroad. Okay, I'm going to show you a slide I showed to a school group the other day, and they loved it. They went wild. They all just started talking. Okay, corn. I don't know why Ohioans love corn, but I decided to. Well, I love corn. My dad grew corn. That's what we did on our farm. But if you were an enslaved person that was planning a trip, planning an escape, and you wanted to get to Ohio, if you could pick your time of the year to do that, and you had a long distance to go, you picked early fall. Early fall was your friend because corn was your friend. And in that blue band that I just showed you, they don't grow cotton in that blue band, they grow corn, okay? So corn, how many people have hidden in a cornfield? I have. You can walk a straight line in a cornfield. If you want, you can sleep in there, and no one's gonna know you're in there. And you can eat the corn up until the time the kernels turn hard. You got a food source. So corn was a big help to the Underground Railroad, and most people don't discuss that, but maybe because my dad was a corn guy, I kind of got into that. Okay, so early decades of the Underground Railroad, people of color helping people of color. Few Quakers, and I don't know when your Thomas Roach is pretty early. He is exceptionally early, he is. But not that many people, not that many white people were really involved before about 1830, but he was an exception. But in the 1830s, what happened? Here's some things that happened. Real railroads developed. And at the same time, a lot in the 1830s, mid-1830s, 1840s, a lot more white people got involved in the Underground Railroad. And I like the chicken and the egg because nobody knows, did these have some relationship to each other, or did one cause the other? Who knows? But both those things did happen. Okay, the name, do you know where the name Underground Railroad came from? It's kind of fun. There was an enslaved person who was fleeing Kentucky. He got himself, he swam across the Ohio River and got himself to Ripley, Ohio, which was a very important town down there for river crossings. His owner, the man who claimed ownership, was following him, but he wasn't about to swim, so he looked around and found a rowboat, but that took extra time. So Tice Davis got into Ripley first, before the owner, and the owner thought, I can find him. He's all wet. He's a black man, and how many wet black men are going to be there? But he never found him, ever. And he was sort of amazed by that. The owner was amazed, and he said, he was interviewed, and he said it was like he had gone off on some underground road. Okay, so the abolitionist press picked that up. But because railroads were so cool in the 1830s, they're better than the latest iPhone. The railroads were the latest, coolest thing. They kind of switched it to railroad lingo. And that's when you got all this stuff about depots, station operators, and conductors. So they were really jazzed on their railroad lingo. But anyway, we got the term Underground Railroad, which it's okay to apply that to everything that went on way back to 1800. Even in 1810, no one said the word railroad because they never heard of that. But the term Underground Railroad means a system of people working together to help freedom seekers get, just assured safety. We can apply that now to the whole effort, even though the term didn't get invented until halfway through it. Okay, so the Underground Railroad keeps growing. Then we get the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, and I know a lot of you know about that, but that made it a federal offense. There had always been some laws against helping freedom seekers, but now it got a lot worse. The Fugitive Slave Law said it made it a federal offense. You also were required to aid the federal marshals who were trying to enforce this thing. It was very, very unpopular here in Ohio, and the federal marshals were too, and that's going to show up in what I'm going to read you. Okay, I'm getting a little further ahead here. Railroads, let's talk more about railroads. Public transportation in the Underground Railroad. Okay, here's a confusing thing. Who thinks trains really were used in the Underground Railroad? They were, yeah. Yeah, they weren't underground, they were just regular old trains. And canal boats as well, even before the trains. So you could be a freedom seeker hiding in cargo on one of these things, but you could also be a ticketed passenger. And you may have had that up in here, and you may indeed know about that. it was not uncommon for, it was more of a northern Ohio, central on up, than in the south where there was more people out of Kentucky and slave catchers down there. But from, you know, here on up, you had ticketed passengers. Well, that required you to look good. That required you to have good clothes, good shoes. And the fundraising that went along with the Underground Railroad was a very important part of it that we don't talk about a lot. Here's another slide I showed the school kids the other day, and they loved it, so I thought I'd show it to you. But if you look like these folks, I don't know who they are, I found their pictures, but if you've got her wonderful dress on or his nice suit, you can buy a ticket. No one's going to question you. So there were indeed ticketed passengers riding trains in the Underground Railroad. There's more in my book. Oh, geez, okay. Okay, well, we're just going to move on to the reading now. Let's just do that. Let's go Udney Hyde, Addison White and Udney Hyde. Those folks I told you about. There's Addison and there's Udney. And, okay, they're in this little town of Mechanicsburg. Udney has the bad leg. Addison's been there for 9 months. Okay, Addison stays in a little loft in one end of the Hyde home, and that's where he is when this reading occurs. Other people in the article, in the reading, are Udney Hyde's teenage daughter, Amanda. Udney Hyde's wife, the white man's wife, has recently died. So they're sad, but besides that, Amanda has all this housework to do. And Addison White, the freedom seeker, helps her carry wood and water and all that stuff they had to do. And they become kind of pals. And over the winter, Amanda taught Addison to read. So Addison's now literate. The other person in the article is the oldest son, Russell, has married and lives next door. And for this reading, it takes about 3 or 4 minutes to read it. The the federal marshals have been tipped off that there's probably a freedom seeker staying with Udney Hyde, and they've come to pick him up. And no one likes those federal marshals, at least in Mechanicsburg they don't. Okay, I think that's what you need to know. It's an early morning in May. It's 1857. The year is 1857. It's first thing in the morning in some May morning. White was clearly not coming down on his own, so one of the marshals determined to go up and get him. He started up the ladder, shotgun in hand, not realizing that White was also armed. As soon as the marshal's head appeared in the opening, White fired his pistol. Fortunately, the ball glanced off the shotgun barrel before tearing off some of the man's ear tissue in Van Gogh-like fashion. The dazed marshal fell backward to the floor, convinced he had been mortally wounded. His equally stunned companions fled to the outside, offering no aid. They were unsure what to do and were particularly befuddled by Udney Hyde, who had stayed in bed during the entire altercation. Even after the shooting, he was still in bed. Under his blankets, there was nothing visible about any injury, so through the doorway, they asked Amanda why her father was bedbound. Decades later, she claimed to have no idea what inspired her response. He has smallpox. The words burst out of her mouth. This is true. I don't make this stuff up. The words burst out of her mouth, seemingly on their own. Already terrified at the armed black man overhead, they now had smallpox to contend with as well. It was about this time that Hyde called to Amanda, "Mandy, it's time to go feed the chickens." Amanda, as quick-witted as her father, knew that he did not give a damn about feeding chickens at that particular moment, but she played along. Grabbing the pail of cracked corn, she plodded out into a damp morning toward the coop. Reaching the chickens, she kept going on a trot. A marshal noticed and hollered at her, threatening to shoot. The unfazed 15-year-old simply ran faster. while one of the men pursued. Fleet of foot, she beat the older man to her brother Russell's house. Thinking that he had no quarrel with whoever that neighbor was and that she was just a scared kid, the marshal left the siblings alone. Russell immediately grasped what was going on and ran to find a fast horse. He hopped on and galloped to town. Next comes the scene that deserves to be more famous than it is. Like a latter-day Paul Revere, Russell rode through the town shouting, "Addison White is being taken! Addison White is being taken!" A lot of people who ordinarily pretended not to know Addison White suddenly knew precisely who he was. He had lived among them all winter. He was helping Udney out while Udney was laid up. What good people did. The men and boys of the town, and a few women too, grabbed whatever they could find and headed out through the drizzling rain to the Hyde farm. Pitchforks, sickles, scythes, hay rakes, hoes, carpet beaters, whatever. The mechanics of Mechanicsburg clutched metal rods or their sharpest tools. A large rabble of people brandishing improvised weapons soon appeared at Hyde's cabin. The wounded marshal had finally collected himself to find he only had a bleeding ear and, discerning he was not about to die, had rejoined his companions outside. Once again, a full group of 8, they were confronted by the spokesman for the damp and shivering townspeople, many of whom had not bothered to wear coats. He told the lawmen in no uncertain terms they had 5 minutes and 5 minutes only to leave. Seeing no other options, the lawmen did. The anti-slavery leanings of Mechanicsburg were well on display that day, and the town had won round 1. But the battle was far from over, and everyone knew it. And there's more. It goes on. There's more to the story, but I think we need to wrap this up. I don't usually tell the rest of the story. It's in the book. But, Addison. Yeah, this is a story I think you'll like. It's a good one. And I like Amanda a lot in that. Addison continues being a hero, and so does teenage Amanda. When the marshals come back, she gets to be a hero again. Addison does, he goes and gives speeches with Frederick Douglass, among other things. He fights with the Massachusetts 54th. He's a total American hero, and we need to know about him. He eventually comes home and marries this lady, but that's well, it's one of my favorite stories in the book. There's also John Parker. Have any of you heard of John Parker down in Ripley? He's his story would be every bit as entertaining, but I can only read one because we run out of time. So that's what I have, and we should move to quick Q&A if we're going to have one at all, I guess.